Hi, this is Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for That's a Good Question, episode 63. What about the Texas abortion law, the January 6th commission, and the Kraken lawyers? Welcome back. Last week we did kind of a new thing that we're going to start doing every month, probably end of the month, and that is to generally ask, what about the headlines? And so we started taking a look at a couple of issues last week, and we started with, I'll get to that actually in a minute. I'll talk about what we're going to talk about this week. Abortion has been in the news this week, and that's obviously a subject that is of interest to Christians, to our audience. And the news on it this week involved a law that the state of Texas passed, and it involved the Supreme Court. The Texas law doesn't outlaw abortion entirely in the state, but almost, because it says that no abortion can be performed after a heartbeat's been detected. And that's usually around 6 weeks, right? So that law restricts abortion from a much earlier stage of pregnancy than any other state laws that restrict how late an abortion can be permitted. So at 6 weeks, sometimes a woman doesn't even know that she's pregnant. And so the practical effect of this law is the criminalization of abortion in Texas. And that's just one state out of 50. But if you listen to the news coverage, you'd think that abortion's been outlawed throughout the country. You'd think Roe versus Wade has been overturned. And that's because the U.S. Supreme Court got involved. And so let's explain. Let's start off this week by explaining how that went from Texas to the Supreme Court and what that might mean for abortion in our country in the future.
Well, first, a disclaimer that, of course, neither of us are attorneys, and some of this involves some legalese that I've done some reading this week on, and so understand enough to be
Put
dangerous.
Some fine print under the bottom of the screen there.
That's right.
We are not lawyers, and we
don't try this at home.
Yeah.
But we'll play one on TV here. And, so know enough to be dangerous on it, but the short answer is that the Supreme Court got involved on a technicality and ruled on a technicality. But we'll just take a little bit to try to explain some of what that is. As you said, Texas passed this law to prohibit abortion after a heartbeat is detected. So they didn't outright prohibit all abortion because that would have been struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional since the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision, then 1992 Casey versus Planned Parenthood decision of the Supreme Court. Those are still the law of the land. And unless and until the Supreme Court reverses them, which it may do, more on that a little bit later, but until that happens, you can't out and out outlaw abortion, all abortion. So the state of Texas knew better than to just outlaw abortion completely, but that's the practical effect of what they did, as you said. But what made news this week is that the Supreme Court got involved by sort of refusing to get involved. What happens when any law is passed is that those who believe they're going to be adversely affected by it will sue the government agency that's in charge of enforcing it, saying to the court, in effect, they can't do that, and here's why. Now, that's not unusual. It happens all the time. But, and here's where it gets confusing, it can take months or even years for a court to decide on the particular merits that are being brought before it. So in the meantime, those who believe they're being harmed by whatever the law requires or by whatever it prohibits, they'll be suffering that harm for those months or years while the case goes through the court. So those who believe they're being harmed will then ask the court to issue what's called an injunction on the enforcement of the law while it's going through court. And an injunction says the government cannot take action based on this law until the court has had its chance to rule on the lawsuit. So if the case takes months or years, things could go on as they did before the law passed until the court determines whether this is indeed valid. And that's what those who oppose to the Texas law had asked the Supreme Court to do, issue an injunction that would keep the law from being enforced until it makes its way through the courts. But the court did not. That's what happened this week. The court did not take that action. Instead, it issued a ruling that says the Texas law can go into full effect immediately. And as we speak now, it is the law in Texas.
So we should talk about why the Supreme Court said that it was doing that. But first, let's make sure that we're clear on what an injunction is so everybody understands. Can you give an example to help explain that?
Yeah, maybe an illustration would help. So let's say that, have you seen this? You've seen these one-wheel things?
Yes.
You've seen those, right?
I have,
and
yeah.
they're these, they're one for our viewers. They're this one wheel, as the name suggests, and then you can stand
Just
on
in case
little
you don't know what
platform.
he's doing here, I am an avid one-wheel fan.
Oh, is that okay,
Yes,
all right. Well, then this is very apt, then, it turns out. You've got these one-wheel things.
I
And then
love
you've
how
got
in the notes you didn't mention one wheel. You just mentioned mode of transportation. I feel like I've been ambushed here. Sorry, go ahead. This is an illustration of an injunction.
Yeah, so you got the one wheels, and even there are people out there riding these. These aren't just young people riding these. These are people nearly 50 years old that are out riding these things. And let's suppose that the state or the city of Brownstown, where you live, gets concerned about the safety. I mean, you've got these older people out there doing this. They're a risk to themselves. They're falling off of these things, and they're going out in traffic. Can
I just tell you, the fact that you use this as an illustration today is so hilarious. You see my knee?
I do. Oh, wow.
This happened today, and I'm not even going to share how it happened because it's very embarrassing. It has to do with forgetting to turn the power button on before stepping on.
Okay, see, the older you get, then the harder it is to maneuver and remember.
It wasn't a physical malady; it was a mental malady.
There you go. So they're concerned about this is becoming a safety hazard for the individuals, for other individuals, and so they say nobody over 50 can operate a one wheel.
That'd be horrible.
Okay, and so the people who are harmed by that would come and say, not just I'm harmed because I don't like it, but rather here are some tangible ways that it harms me, and
How
you
am
can
I
do
gonna
that.
get to work?
Well, that's right. Now I've started my gearing my life around this. I'm using it to go to work very often. I've even started, giving tutorials to people. I've made a little bit of a living on it or something, so whatever. And so these are the ways that it would harm me. I'm asking you now to issue an injunction until the court finally decides whether this is valid use of government power so that I can continue to go about my business. And that is what then the folks who were opposed to the Texas law were asking the Supreme Court to do. Just say this thing cannot go into effect.
Got it. That was a very helpful illustration to me. I totally get what an injunction is now. So, in all seriousness, injunctions are pretty routine.
Yeah.
They're granted all the time.
Right.
So why didn't the court give one in this case?
Well, the Texas legislators were frankly a bit sneaky on how they wrote the law. They wrote it in a way as to make it, in their minds, and as it turns out, it worked, impossible for the court to issue an injunction against it. Now, in that illustration about the one wheel, and with all laws that are appealed to the court, it's always the government that enforces the law. So they pass the law and they say if you violate it, you're going to be arrested and face fines and or jail time. In order for the law to be enforced, then, an arm of the government gets involved. The police, the IRS, the Secretary of State, whoever. And they can't take action on that law, though, if an injunction is placed. The police can't do anything. The IRS can't do anything. The Secretary of State can't do anything until the law has been reviewed. So Texas knows all of this. So they wrote the law in a way that the government it's not the government that enforces it. They wrote it in a way that it's the citizens of Texas.
You said sneaky. Seems clever and sneaky.
And sneaky, yeah, clever too, because it worked. It got, the court. So who can be sued in order to keep it from being enforced? And-
you hear the people versus the state of. This would be the state versus the people.
All the people, yeah. What would you do? So the people who oppose it on the pro-abortion side, who are they going to sue?
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to sue the police. They're not going to sue the IRS. They're not going to sue the enforcers, because now the enforcers are all the citizens. So who is the court going to enjoin to say you can't do this? So who's the court going to tell they can't enforce the law, since it's everybody in the state? So pro-life journalist and lawyer David French said this: normally when a legislature passes a pro-life law, it's easy for abortion providers to file a suit and block the law in court. They simply sue the state officials who are charged with enforcing it. They secure an injunction against that enforcement, and they continue on with their abortion practice. But since the Texas law is enforced by private lawsuit, the abortion providers faced a challenge. Who can they sue to block enforcement? They couldn't sue millions of Texas citizens individually, so they chose to sue a state court judge and a single Texas citizen. I take that to mean that this Texas citizen was like a pro-life advocate, and so they chose this person to say, here's an example of a person who would be enforcing this. But then what happened was that individual that they sued filed an affidavit and said, no, I'm not going to do anything with it.
Wow.
So they were really stuck. So David French says, so how did the Supreme Court respond? A short way of describing the ruling is by saying that the plaintiffs, that would be the pro-abortion side, sued the wrong defendants. The private citizen filed this affidavit saying he wasn't going to enforce the law, and the court said, it's not clear, this is a quote from the court, whether under existing precedent this court can issue an injunction against state judges asked to decide a lawsuit under Texas's law.
Wow. So you mentioned earlier Roe versus Wade and the Casey case. So what does this mean for overturning those precedents?
Yeah.
If, so that abortion would be outlawed nationwide?
So this Texas case, made big headlines. Everybody, I am sure, heard about it. And those on the pro-abortion side are very vexed by it. But really, it in itself doesn't mean a whole lot. It's this procedural thing. People have tried to read the tea leaves as to what does it mean that the court ruled the way it did on this injunction. But it's really a procedural thing. I just don't think you should read too much into that. What you should do and anticipate, though, is that there is a case out of Mississippi going back to earlier this year, where Mississippi said you can't have an abortion. It was after 15 weeks. But that has been accepted by the court on its docket. So this is not just an injunction procedural thing now. This is actually looking at the case on its merits and deciding whether or not this can pass constitutional muster. The Mississippi case is a case where they can, if they so choose, the Supreme Court can use that to overturn Roe v. Wade. And people are guessing about what's going to happen. I had, in one of our podcasts some time ago, had said, I think that is going to happen. I believe by this time next year, we are in September of 21, by the late spring, early summer of 22, I think Roe versus Wade will no longer be the law of the land.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but it won't be because of this Texas thing. It's going to be because they already have it. And that, though, is why the pro-abortion side is so exercised.
I can see that, yeah.
Because they see it coming, and they see
part
this
of the wave in their mind. Yeah.
and they see this is the court that refused to intervene to block this Texas law. They now see that's the same court that's going to rule on the Mississippi case. Yeah.
I see. All right. Well, let's move on then to another issue. Last week we spent just about the entire time talking about Afghanistan and the whole debacle of our withdrawal from Afghanistan, and we didn't quite finish. So I just want to spend a few minutes on that and then get to as much as we can of the other issues. We got the Kraken lawyers again and the January 6th investigation. So Afghanistan, you said that our withdrawal is concerning not only in that it's the chaotic way that it happened, but more importantly from a biblical standpoint, the chaos that it leaves behind.
Right.
Because order is important, we believe, because God is one, a God of order, and also that in a fallen world, things tend toward disorder. And so things that bring order are instances of God's common grace to us, to humanity.
Right.
So you see then, as you were describing America's role on the international stage as an example of God's common grace that brings order and stability. So why don't you pick up
Yeah.
there to conclude for us?
Good way to summarize what we talked about last week. And yeah, I do think that America's role in the world, including the fact that we've had a presence in countries around the world for decades, has contributed to world peace. Now, when I say world peace, I'm not just, this is not the beauty pageant, I want world peace thing. When I say world peace, I don't mean...
A new nickname for our pastoral team, the one-wheeler and the beauty king.
Nice. I don't mean that there are no conflicts, that world peace means there are no conflicts anywhere, but that I do mean that they don't widen into larger conflagrations, that other countries then get involved in, and then they just become this huge thing. And that's because other countries are disinclined to confront our military strength. We had 2 world wars in a period of about 30 years. And since that time, America has been the leading power in the world for over 70 years. Us, along with our strategic allies, and that's prevented another world war. In fact, we and our allies defeated, without a shot being fired, the other major threat to world peace for over 40 years, and that was the old Soviet Union and all of its nefarious alliances with what were called the Warsaw Pact nations. We had NATO that we talked about last week, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but in opposition to that, you had the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations. So you had all of this alignment, the Cold War. Everybody was concerned, understandably, that that might develop into a real war. President Ronald Reagan in 1983 called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and people went crazy when he said that, making this sort of moral judgment about this other country. Well, he was absolutely right about that. And by the end of the 80s, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and it left America as not only the most powerful nation in the world, but we were now the world's sole superpower. So keeping peace now, then, one, because we've been very strong since World War II, and then even more so now in the last 30 years because we're the sole superpower. And it's allowed us to help keep world peace. Keeping peace is necessary because peace is not natural among fallen people.
Right.
And that's why Reagan said, hey, peace through strength. And I think that's true. So biblically, taking into account that in a fallen world, things tend toward disorder, and that disorder is dangerous, it's good to have someone as the world's so-called policeman. We've had troops all over the world, but by invitation, not by imposition. That's really important to point out. We've got, since World War II, we've had bases in Germany, right? But by invitation. We're not just staying there and imposing our will.
This is not imperialism.
Exactly. And that has been good for those countries. Otherwise, they would tell us to get out. And it's been good for us as well. So I would say, friends, that we should think twice about our complaints regarding how much we spend on our military presence, how much we spend on foreign aid. I know it's popular and it's easy to do that, to complain that way, but and it is true that others of our allies should contribute more than they do, but we benefit, and the world benefits from the stability that America's strength and presence brings. And by the way, I should just say, it's America's strength right now, but that would be true even if the world power was not America. So I'm not saying this in some kind of nationalistic, jingoistic kind of way. I said last week that Rome played a similar positive role in the world of the New Testament of the first century.
Yeah. So we'll close that discussion off and move on to another topic. But so just to be clear, then we're not saying that whatever America does is by definition good, and that we decide what's good for the rest of the world. That's not what we're saying.
No, that's absolutely right. What you said, that we're not saying that. After the Soviet Union fell in the late 80s in very swift fashion, America was left then with how to act as this suddenly lone now superpower. And over the next 10 years, throughout the 1990s, there were think tanks and there were pundits who talked and debated about what now our role should be. And just as an example of how we don't always get it right. So it doesn't mean whatever America does is good, even though God has providentially placed us in this, I think, important place. But a group developed called the Project for a New American Century. And some of our listeners may recognize some of the names that were involved with that. One was Dick Cheney, who became vice president a few years later. Donald Rumsfeld, who became the Secretary of Defense. Paul Wolfowitz was Rumsfeld's deputy. John Bolton, who just wrote a book, and he's on the news shows still. He was ambassador to the United Nations under George W. Bush. He was national security advisor just a few years ago under President Trump. In fact, of the 25 people that were involved in this project for a new American century, 10 of them ended up working in the administration of George W. Bush. In other words, these were people then who were the architects of getting us into the Iraq War.
Oh, wow.
So is everything America does good? No. And in fact, these are folks who I generally agreed with in terms of seeing America's strong and leading and powerful role as a good thing. But then they went and advocated using that in a way that most now see as a mistake, including myself. They believed many of the things that I've espoused in these last two episodes, but that didn't mean that the right choices were always made, obviously. And so, no, saying that it's good to have a power that keeps peace in a fallen world doesn't mean that power, whether it's America or any other, always does the right thing.
Got it. So order and stability in a fallen world are not only necessary intentionally, internationally, but domestically.
Yeah.
So it's not only the order that a strong military can bring because it keeps any nations that have ill designs at bay, but it's also the internal institutions of our country here at home that keep order. Yeah. Those are manifestations of God's common grace as well, right?
Absolutely.
We've talked about that.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we've talked in the past about what a great blessing our Constitution is. Because, and I urge everyone, when you think of the word Constitution, don't just think of a designator for a document, a name for a document, but think about why it's named that, Constitution, because it's referring to the structure, how the country is constituted, and therefore how it will function. And our founders were wise enough to recognize the need to have the impulses of sinful people constantly in check. And so that's why we talk about our Constitution having these checks and balances. So we should not be people who want to see things torn down. Rioting is not good. Not when it's done by rioters in Minneapolis or Seattle, but also not when it's done at our own capital. I recommend, friends, that all of us should have grave concern whenever and wherever you see our justice system, for example, thwarted, subverted, belittled. Our justice system is a bulwark against disorder. And when that's perverted, it is a real threat to our national peace, to our national tranquility. I mean, here's what the Bible says in Proverbs 24. Proverbs 24:21 says, "Fear the Lord and the king, my son, and do not join with rebellious officials." Now, that word, do not join, the word rebellious, that's translated this way in another version, in the New American Standard. It says this, "My son, fear the Lord and the king. Do not associate," it doesn't say with the rebellious, but with those who are given to change.
Aha. Progressives.
Well, okay. So, and progressives by definition, progress is change.
I wish I knew all this time there was a Bible verse against being a progressive.
But if you want to see change, whether change over time or abrupt change, just be careful about that. Because what you change to may not be better than what you're changing from.
Change in and of itself
is not
is
necessarily
not
good.
Meritorious. Yeah.
And that's the problem a problem and a foundational problem with the progressive mindset is because change is by itself
Have to
good.
keep making
You have to
progress,
keep
yeah.
making progress and changing. Conservatives, on the other hand, want to conserve what is.
This may be distraction, but it just kills me that oftentimes folks who would take that perspective also would insist that there are no absolutes. So what are you progressing toward?
Yeah.
How's anything better? It's just different.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
good. No, it's true. But, you want to be moving forward. You want to be, in fact, MSNBC years ago, progressive, right? Their motto, they've changed it since, but their motto was lean forward.
Oh, I remember that.
Lean forward. So that's the idea that you're always just moving forward, and change is good in itself. But conservatives don't see it that way. So if our viewers, which most of our viewers would consider themselves, ourselves conservative, just bear in mind that you're not like that. And here's that you are not given to change. And that's what that proverb is saying. The rebellious are those who are given to change. It's a warning against hanging with those who want to uproot quickly, uprooting what's been built over a long period of time. It's not saying no change, but we should think long and hard about what change we want to move toward.
Yeah, this is like one of those sermons where you get you going, amen, 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 and then here comes the
Oh no, that applies to us.
yeah, exactly.
Go get those progressives, but no, it applies to us. So whether it's destroying property or whether it's destroying institutions, both of those should be avoided. True conservatives seek to conserve what's good. Of course, we're willing to change what is not,
Right.
but we have to do it very thoughtfully. Riots are not conservative.
Yeah.
No matter where they take place, no matter who leads them, no matter who incites them, do not associate or listen to people who advocate it or people who cover up for it. Okay? So when justice is perverted, remember, order breaks down. So when you see that happen and you see leaders, even if they're your leaders, your favored leaders, and they are decrying judges and belittling judges, you shouldn't like that. Okay? That's dangerous. Judges.
It's not saying you can't ever disagree with a judgment,
Of course.
but just the pure attack, the ad hominem,
Well, an Obama judge. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
A Bush judge, a Trump
just
judge.
placing random people in categories and
You're
making a
politicizing.
judgment.
You are directly politicizing the judiciary when you do that.
which is
Yeah.
what we're supposed to be avoiding.
Judges, the way the Constitution, the way the structure is set up, they're not elected. The reason federal judges and Supreme Court are federal justices, the reason they're not elected is for this very thing,
Yeah.
to keep the partisanship to a bare minimum. Now, I'm not going to say that none of the judges know this. The judges know that they have to tamp down their own biases, okay? But they're trained to do that, and that's our system. And when you start then making it our side versus their side, and only people who were appointed by our people are good judges, now we are perverting the system. They're not elected on purpose. Let me give an example here at home in the United States about how justice can be perverted, and was for a very long time. You know, we still are battling here in 2021 with racial tensions, right? Big time. And we've made progress for sure. We're still having problems with this. Just think back to how it was and how justice, in quotes, was meted out on behalf of African Americans in our country. 1955, that was the year that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus and started the Montgomery bus boycott, all of that. 1955 is also the year that I think he was 14-year-old Emmett Till from Chicago was murdered in Mississippi. Now, he's from Chicago. One summer, he goes down to visit family in Mississippi. His mother in Chicago says, "Emmett, be careful when you're down there." And so he goes into a small grocery store in Money, Mississippi. That's the name of the town. And according to a white woman there, he made some kind of, whistled at her, or made some kind of remark toward her. And she told her husband, and another guy went that night, middle of the night, pulled this young man out of bed, took him to a river, killed him, threw his body in the river with a fan blade tied around him. And he was fished out of this river a day or two later, body bloated, his face is a mess. It was just it's a scary sight. And the reason I say it's a scary sight because I've seen it. You can Google Emmett Till and you will see this, and it's horrific. His mother insisted when they had the funeral for him in Chicago that he have an open casket with that, because she wanted the world to see what had happened to her son. Okay. So this kid, this 14-year-old is murdered. It becomes national news, and this beaten body and is displayed for the nation to see. Life magazine had pictures of his body, all of that. But then Life magazine, shortly after the trial, they have a trial for these two guys in Mississippi. They have the trial. Jury goes and deliberates, all white jury, deliberates for less than 30 minutes. Not guilty. That's the end of it. Not guilty. You don't have a Justice Department in Washington that's now going to say, no. We're going to take this and we're going to move it further along. That's the end of it. And we're going to because you can't try them on criminal charges because of double jeopardy. So even the federal government wouldn't be able to do that, but they could have brought civil charges, which is kind of what happens now. When an unjust verdict is issued, then often now the federal government will step in and say, no, we're going to get some semblance of justice done here. 1955, you're getting none of that. These guys are off the hook. They give an interview to Life magazine shortly after this, and they're bragging about what they did.
Wow.
They're guilty, but they can't be held, and we're not held accountable. So, we all look at that and we say that's wrong, and of course it's horrifically wrong. But when justice is perverted, it is non-Christian. Justice is a godly thing. Justice is part of the biblical worldview, and we should love justice, and we should promote and strengthen and support a judicial system that allows that to happen. So, friends, conservatism is not, just change because you want to see it change and you upset things and you upend things quickly. Think very carefully about that. It's also not libertarianism. Mm-hmm. Conservatism is not the same as libertarianism, but we've got a lot of people that don't tread on me types in our churches that are libertarian, meaning that there can be no infringement upon my freedom at all. And anything that the government does that infringes in any way on my freedom is tyranny and all kinds of, right? So we've gone through
How do you
all
have
that.
laws? Isn't every law an infringement on freedom?
Exactly. And so, but the last year we've seen so much of that.
Yeah.
And we've got politicians who are out there doing that. I mean, Rand Paul, okay? Some of you may be big fans of Rand Paul, okay. Senator from Kentucky. He's a guy who kind of foments this sort of thing, Any infringement on my freedom is do you know, how many people do you all know who are named Rand? Now, why does that matter? Well,
Ian Rand?
Yes.
Is that really? I didn't know.
Yes. The late philosopher, Russian, Soviet, became an American, and because had been born in the Soviet Union and hated the communistic, totalitarian kind of system, then was very attuned to any infringement upon liberty. And so sometimes pronounced Anne or Ayn Rand, A-Y-N, Rand. And she wrote the books Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, which are just wildly popular with libertarian types, okay? Mm-hmm. But she was an atheist, libertarian philosopher.
Also ironic.
Right. And here is Ron Paul, Rand's dad, who ran for president on the libertarian ticket. And he has a son, and he names his son after Ayn Rand, okay? So that's just who Rand Paul is. That's just who his family is, okay? If that's what you're into, okay, I'm encouraging you to have some caution about that. I mean, libertarianism, any infringement upon my liberty, do you really want a warrant or not a warrant, but a warrant after you're on the plane? In other words, if you find out that there is a terrorist, on the plane, don't you want to know that ahead of time, before the plane takes off? Well, how do we do that? We have you go through a metal detector. We do these searches. Now I understand the Fourth Amendment in the Constitution protects against unlawful searches and seizures, but guys like Rand Paul are very concerned about all of that, those safety precautions, because you're searching people who haven't done anything. Mm-hmm. So when you go through that and I go through that, there's no suspicion that we've done anything. But for safety, we all do it. Mm-hmm. Well, for my money, I'm good with that. I'm good with giving up that measure of my liberty for the safety of myself and of other people. I don't want to hear, we now got the search warrant for the guy who's on the plane, but he's already on the plane, right? I don't want that. So I'm concerned that we have seen our justice system perverted on our side. And we've been okay with it because we think it's for good ends.
So seeing some of the same things over the years, we've identified political opponents as guilty of.
Yes.
But we're okay as long as it's for the right cause. Is what you're saying? Our cause.
That's what I'm saying. We think it's for the right cause. 5 years ago, many people who consider themselves conservatives got excited about a guy who was not a politician. That's why we're excited, because he's not a politician, and he's going to go to Washington, and he's going to, how many times did we hear this? He's going to shake things up, right? Okay, but what's that going to mean? What's going to be shaken up? If it means going and shaking politicians out of their self-satisfied complacency so that they do their jobs and they do them well, okay. Of course, we're good with that. But what if it means shaking up the judicial system in self-serving ways, or shaking up the levers of government for your own ends?
Yeah. Well, that kind of segues into a couple of other topics that have been in the news. See if we've got a couple of minutes.
How much time is it?
It's about 36 minutes.
All right.
So the January 6th insurrection investigation. And there's also, we mentioned last week, the Kraken lawyers. And if you don't know what the Kraken lawyers are, watch last week's episode where we explain that. What's the concern in these news items here?
So I'll just say this, and then we can go into the 1-6 investigation and the Kraken thing. I'll end it with this today, okay? But what we're learning, what we've learned, is that in the 2 months after the November 3rd election and the January 20th inauguration, in those almost 2 months, the things that former President Trump was doing amount to, in my mind, they amount to a non-military coup. Firing and replacing people in the government in order to have people in place to overturn the election. So I don't make that up. I'll give you the names, okay? I mean, Bill Barr, of all people, who was the Attorney General and who was very supportive of Trump, finally in December just resigned right before Christmas. He didn't explain why at the time, but he resigned because he was being asked to do things that he just could not do. Well, now you have people in the Justice Department who are going to be moved up to Attorney General, and the president looked for a guy to do that, a fellow named Jeffrey Clark. Google Jeffrey Clark, okay? We need some answers from a guy named Jeffrey Clark who's like down here in the Justice Department, but he becomes elevated to become Attorney General. Trump wanted him to be the Attorney General. The other people said, you do this, we all resign en masse. It kept it from happening.
Wow.
But the point is it was attempted, that this was actually happening. So this is what I mean about the perversion. You're going to go and shake things up. Well, that depends on what's being shaken up. And we cannot afford to have these institutions that are, as I said earlier, this bulwark against chaos in a fallen world. We need justice. We need a Justice Department that does justice and holds people accountable and doesn't act on political favors and act for the particular president that's in power. There needs to be a distance between the Justice Department and the White House. But you didn't have that going on here. And it was extremely extremely dangerous. We came much closer than people realize to having a coup take place in our country. I mean, this is the only, and I'll be done, but this is the only transition we've ever had like this.
Yeah.
You know, and then we had a riot that we'll talk about then next week on January 6th, because that's in the news again. So my whole concern about justice and God's concern, more important, about justice and being people who love justice, even if justice cuts in a way that is not what we wanted. Mm-hmm. We want justice done, right? And we want institutions that do justice and that they don't play politics. And we had that threatened. And so let's be aware of that. And then that will segue, as you said, into the Kraken lawyers and what they were doing with the judicial system and how they were, frankly, misrepresenting things before judges, and how thankfully we have a judicial system that is holding.
And that's not just your depiction.
No,
that's their admission now after the fact.
After the fact, they've had to now admit it, and the courts are throwing the book at them. Mm-hmm. I mean, one has lost. Rudy Giuliani lost his law license, suspended, and others are now threatened with losing their law license, and have just had the book absolutely thrown at them because you cannot make a mockery of our court system. Thank God. Thank the Lord that we still have a judicial system where people cannot walk in and just make whatever claim they want. Mm-hmm. And that when you do that, you're going to have to suffer consequences. Answer for it. Okay.
Good. All right. Well, that was very helpful discussion, explanations of these topics. And so we'll finish up next week some of these items in the news. And in the meantime, if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, do that. Hit the notification bell so you're alerted when we come out with new videos, which we do every Saturday at 2 p.m. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the next one. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.